Thank you for having me. It's kind of like weird that no one can see their audiences anymore, but thank you for whoever is watching. Um, I'd like to also thank a very good friend of mine, Benjamin Brewer, who I really owe a lot for helping me with all the German stuff, everything that has to do with Germany and German, as I was working on this paper, and I'm still working on this paper, including the translation of Oscar Becker's essay that I will be talking about today. So I'll just jump in since I don't have much time. And I'll start with an epigraph. One always inherits from a secret, Jacques Derrida. Once referring to the debt he owed to Martin Heidegger for his research on the question of death, Emmanuel Levinas explained that though he distinguished his work from Heidegger's thought, he did so in spite of whatever the debt every contemporary thinker owed to Heidegger, a debt that, Levinas then quipped, one often owes to his regret. There remains indeed perhaps one important lesson to learn from the structures of inheritance. These might have shown that to strictly delimit any given context, to draw fixed boundaries and implement borders of strict discursive autonomy, bequeath monumental difficulties. Contexts are often hard to evaluate, even more so when the urgencies of a crisis call for retreat onto familiar, perhaps even filial grounds. Such recoil, of course, are certainly not always the product of a crisis. They can, as the protracted history of Western philosophy has shown, be merely points of departure and the very grounds of theoretical interventions. That is, the site from which the devotional work of filial piety strives for purity, immunity, and the countless subterfuges intended to maintain the longue durée of biopolitical necessities. For even when, as Jacques Derrida has shown, philosophy's self-reflexive identity feigns a crisis as its very condition of possibility, if autocritique as philosophy's truth forges its partiality, which in turn allows it to legislate over all regions of being and objectivity, such alibi has worked to conceal the hubris of its own discursive imperialism. As Derrida points out, philosophy's jurisdiction is indeed seemingly unbounded. By assigning the limits and legitimacy of all other regional disciplines, the alibi of philosophy's autocritical movements becomes the reproduction of its own authority. So to do philosophy, therefore, authenticates the processual schemas of such autocratic voice in the name of critique, and more specifically, under the aegis of its ostentatious ability to turn critique inward. My aim today isn't so much to raise a pious indictment of hegemonic discourses. I'm also less concerned with tragically acknowledging an indebtedness to philosophy as a prelude for an attack. Rather, I would like to assess the risk and potential gains of unwanted inheritances, unexpected affinities, violent friendships, or the ghastly proximity of a family one never chose. Are we indeed obligated to respect the authority of filial responsibility of such consanguinity? When do we cease to be philosophy's illegitimate heirs? And more importantly, for those still held captive in the afterlife of its discursive barracoons, how does one occupy the inescapable sites of one's own unending condemnation? So let me go straight to the point and occupy another Derridian claim. La philosophie est une ontologie. Philosophy is an ontology. but allow me to modify the claim, or perhaps even in a Spivakian sense, bungle it, and say with a certain kind of temerity, philosophy is ontology. For the time being, let us bracket the slight crude nature of my amendment and consider the central matter of my remarks. These are the relationship between Blackness and ontology in relation to the authoritative protocols of a discourse in the face of which Frantz Fanon once determined the Black has no resistance. It is indeed still difficult to measure the force of this passage in Peau Noire Masque Blanc, and even still intricate to assess its notoriety or the vast amount of polemics in which it continues to be marred. We know, for instance, that the long passage leading to this infamous sentence raised a number of questions for Fred Moten. Having acknowledged the ontological drama that the passage stages for us, Moten asked in his important essay, The Case for Blackness, and I quote him, "How do we think the possibility and the law of outlawed impossible things? And if, as Frantz Fanon suggests, the Black cannot be another for another Black, if the Black can only be another for a white, then is there anything called Black social life? Who bears the responsibility of discovering an ontology of, or discovering for ontology, the ensemble of political, aesthetic, and philosophical derangement that comprise the being that is neither for itself nor for the other," unquote. These questions then lead Moten to more inquiries, whereby what appears to call for thinking is the possibility of accounting for that which cannot be accounted for in the language of philosophy. Rather than abiding to the hermeneutical constraint of classical ontology, including the eradicating violence of Dasein's historicity that enables investigation into the transcendental grounds of existence, Moten chooses a different, one can even name it, an interruptive hermeneutical option, unfaithful to the ostensible connections between the demand of interpretation, which he calls explanation, and resistance. He names this mode of interpretation para-ontology, which, as we will see, is a mode of apprehending what remains infinitely concealed at the level of ontology. Para-ontology, as Moten has pointed out more than once, is a concept which he inherits from the Black philosopher Naomi Chandler. Many more contemporary thinkers working in the field of Black studies have indeed acknowledged their own debt to Chandler. Moten, most notably, credits Chandler for providing a conceptual opening for a renewed thinking of Blackness as mode of resisting ongoing regimes of racial predation. So typifying disturbance, therefore, para-ontology offers us the possibility of considering Blackness beyond, though always with and against, the violence of its constitution. Indeed, in its multiple iteration, para-ontology belongs to a recent ontological turn in Black studies, whereby the questions, what does it mean to be Black, has increasingly caused significant discursive upheavals, not only in canonically established scholarship in Black studies, philosophy, as the legislating science for all science, is gradually bearing the pressure of a Black inquest determined to stage its case imminently. The subversive force of this moment is undeniable, and the range of responses it continues to offer to the question, what does it mean to be Black, are equally incontrovertible. But the ramification of transformative events can only be hard to detect, especially when the subject matter's unwieldiness defies conventional patterns or processes of signification. In other words, though para-ontology seems to rise to the challenge of its onto-epistemic task, the force of its intervention might have compressed many of its own hermeneutical passages, including, but certainly not limited to, its genealogical trajectories or even its very condition of possibility. It is indeed here that I would like us to linger this evening, not so much with the aim to merely trace the ambivalent history of a concept. All concepts arguably have modeled history. Rather, I wonder what it would mean to consider Chandra's wish, which he implies in his address to Cornell University Society of Humanities in 2018, that his work on para-ontology remain perennial rather than merely fashionable. There are, of course, many ways to attend to Chandra's call, but since in the same lecture, he describes his project of para-ontology as a desedimenting deconstruction and genealogy, it seems to me that an apt response would be to trace the history of the concept para-ontology back to its first use by Heidegger student Oscar Becker, whose main concern uncannily echoes the concept's seemingly axiomatic use in Black studies, namely a radical disruption in the hegemonic and totalizing logic of ontology. I know that Ronald Judy has made a bit of a pedantic fuss in the footnotes, one of the footnotes, or the endnotes rather, of in his chapter on para-ontology, where he says he's adamant that Becker was not Heidegger's student, but his colleague, and that there are the same age. I mean, I'm not sure how indisputable it is. Becker has definitely, it appears, a teacher-mentor relationship with Heidegger. In Sentient Flesh, Thinking in Disorder, Poiesis in Black, R.A. Judy, of course, began this work. However, Judy, who looks to eschew ontology altogether, so that not even something like the para-ontological could survive, what he calls poiesis in Black, commits to what appears to be a resolute refusal to expand the master discourse by abandoning it without any guilt whatsoever. This could essentially mean reclaiming an ethical politics of Black guiltlessness that would leave ontology on the wayside rather than succumbing to ontology's endless condemnation of Black being. So without necessarily clarifying the structure of this refusal, for little is conveyed as to how the residual effect of a persisting and enforced master discourse might have on the desire and possibility for flight in the case of Judy, or fugitivity for Moten. Judy is prepared to posit an alternative Black plenum, albeit one attuned to the differences of multiplicity, in contradistinction to Heidegger's difference, which he claims ultimately, and I quote, aims at the indivisible, integral human being, unquote. The extent to which the charge is indeed a fair representation of Heidegger's fundamental ontology isn't so much an issue for the time being, because as we know, the existential analytic of Dasein is continuously interrupted by the threat of its own undoing, so to speak, insofar as absence, error, impropriety, foreignness, untruth, or impossibility are not mere aberration to Dasein, but belong to the very structure of its being. In fact, Judy argues that Oscar Becker's ontology opens the way for, quote, a more careful understanding of poiesis in Black as parasymbiosis, unquote, precisely because, somewhat unlike Jacques Lacan, who cannot renounce his fraternity with Heidegger, and who thus can only repurpose Becker's ontology in the service of ontology indisputability, Becker's corrective mentic phenomenology attends to what is ungraspable, but by the hermeneutical phenomenology of Dasein. In other words, Judy welcomes Becker's para-ontology as a discursive bridge to parasemiosis, not only because of its potentially heroic displacement of ontology, but because Becker's para-ontology does demonstrate at long last that some entities cannot be captured by the hermeneutical structure of meaning. Of course, one emblematic example of such opaque entity is, for Judy, Blackness. However, what is interesting is that having spent a considerable amount of time proving how Blackness functioned as a heuristic for the irremediable limits of Heidegger's ontological analytic, Judy then proceeds to define Blackness in relation to parasemiosis and parapoiesis without really telling us how both concepts, interpretive and semiological disposition, enable him to read Blackness beyond the concept's ongoing activity of creating referentiality. In other words, I am asking what makes Blackness available to parasemiosis? What is it about the semiological structure of parasemiosis that renders the concept capable to define Blackness? Is parasemiosis then a Black transcendental ground of understanding? The stakes are perhaps higher than what Judy's invitation to turn our backs to ontology can afford. For what might be necessary prior to the moment of a definitive refusal is to think both the essence and the possibility of refusal as such, which is also to say that what might call for interpretive work is neither flight nor fugitivity in the plenitude of their movements, but their own carceral effects on the very entity they seek to liberate, that is, Blackness. For to assume that flight and/or fugitivity do mean exactly what they mean, and that they, taken at face value, can or must circumvent the critical projects that Blackness or Black people summon us to undertake, and that's notwithstanding the peculiar deremption between Blackness and Black people in both Judy's and Mouton's respective works, would amount to a facile refutation that merely calls attention to the determinate movements of flight and escape without necessarily displacing the totalizing principle of ontology, including the structural necessity of the violence it must sustain on Black being or non-being. It matters really little at this point. So I reckon that this is indeed what Chandler suggests when he says, and I quote him, "I cannot get away from the problem of ontology." And this is not said in a simple parenthetical remark in his own reckoning with the hegemony of philosophy. Far more to the contrary, as a founding implication of his para-ontological method, Chandler argues that any retreat from ontology, or, and I quote, "the force of any claim made under such a heading, on such an order of generality, would remain without measure or effective displacement," unquote. It is therefore slightly puzzling to recognize in Mouton, who is always careful to invoke Chandler while claiming also to deviate from his notion of parontology, an attempt to stage a retreat, albeit one always hidden behind the veneer of a performative epistemic modesty or a rehearsed discursive hypervigilance, that is nonetheless incessantly engaged in a tug of war with a tradition Mouton himself can only disavow by a necessary, inescapable, and simultaneously avowal of the discourse he seeks, like Judy, to denounce. The perverse synchronicity of this haunting restriction, a stricture indeed that operates like an unending sentence on the Black philosopher's attempt at flight, is exactly what permits Moten to refuse a strict adequation between classical ontology and Blackness, while at the same time, he can imperiously interject, against Fanon, that the problem for Blackness isn't so much ontology, but the violence of given ontology. And this is ultimately what allows him to shelter Black fugitivity from ontology's tenacious summoning and declare that, quote, resistance is better understood as paraontological insofar as it is directed toward the structure of dominance, not only in society, but in ontology as well, unquote. Surprisingly, Moten reads Fanon and the many contemporary critics driven by the presumption, according to Moten, that the Black has no ontological resistance as the one guilty of a naive evasion of the ontological question in its relation to Blackness, specifically in the way Blackness puts pressure on ontology. And that's, of course, Moten's language. This assessment, which is one clear example of the nagging ambivalence by which Moten seems to be torn without necessarily bringing himself to admit explicitly, positions his version of paraontology somewhat at odds with Chandler's. For even if Moten readily admits to speak with and against ontology, he hardly ever says anything substantial about what consequences paraontology's ambivalent relation with ontology might sustain on the very pressure Blackness is said to have on ontology. And this pervasive operative disavowal is indeed why he can then accuse Fanon of deploying an anti-ontological method, which paradoxically forgets Blackness's paraontological force. Hence, in a move fairly reminiscent of Oscar Becker's first use of the term paraontology in relation to Heidegger's fundamental ontology, Moten doesn't seem to have a serious bone to pick with ontology, so to speak. Rather, in addition to sidestepping the violence of ontology that he only obliquely condemns without substantially accounting for why he is nevertheless forced to be complicit with that violence in order to speak of Blackness's paraontological force, in short, why the violence of ontology continues to function nonetheless as the condition for the possibility of the paraontological enunciation, Moten's main paraontological rejoinder is that ontology is an impoverished discourse, unequipped to capture or even read the excess which Blackness is without being the exclusive property of Black people. As we shall see in a moment, like Becker, Moten wants to displace the historical bent or historicism, or what he seems to call a legal empiricism of contemporary critics' treatment of Blackness. So this is why he's prepared with some level of astonishing ease to divide things up between what falls within the realm of paraontology, such as Blackness, fugitivity, homelessness, resistance, or refusal, and the paraontologically impoverished jurisdiction of a historical legal empiricism broad enough to include Fanon on the one hand and Daniel Patrick Moynihan on the other. What Fanon and Moynihan share in this startling genealogy, which reads more like a peremptory and hyperbolic embellishment of poetic expediency than a legitimately scathing accusation, is that they both cannot think beyond the immediacy of experience. They cannot reach beyond the violence that constitutes Blackness, but to which Blackness is fundamentally irreducible. This is indeed not awfully remote from Becker's criticism of Heidegger's fundamental ontology, which Becker argues is unequipped to account for anything not subsumable by the Heideggerian tropes of world and being. So let me now turn to Becker. It is indeed Becker who first uses the term paraontology in the context of his ongoing attempt at formulating a phenomenology able to account for those entities that Heidegger's hermeneutic phenomenology cannot, such as mathematics, nature, or the eternal truth of logic. In his 1937 essay, Transcendence and Paratranscendence, Becker names his semantic phenomenological elaboration paraontology. Though I would not describe Becker's version of paraontology as simply an amendment, or more scandalously, I would say an improvement of Heidegger's existential analytic of Dasein, as Judy does, it is indeed the case that Becker does not perceive Heidegger's fundamental ontology to be intrinsically antagonistic to paraontology. Heidegger, Becker argues, is justified to consider Dasein as the foundation of the world and of being. Becker insists, however, that there exists another realm of co-equal importance, which is neither derivative nor simply reducible to Dasein. Becker indeed admired Heidegger. In a letter addressed to the philosophy at the occasion of his 70th birthday, for instance, Becker fondly recalls that when he arrived in Freiburg in 1919 to study with Husserl, Heidegger's lecture rapidly and surprisingly fascinated the freshly discharged young soldier who, he says in passing, was gradually disappointed in one aging Husserl. Thus, Becker writes, and I quote him, "What made the greatest impression on me of your lecture," Heidegger's lecture, was the disclosure of a wholly new world, the fascinating discovery of a new or unobserved phenomena, like the self world, which referred to something even more original, that which you called then the spontaneity of the self, truth as discovery and discovery of origin. But just about a line later, Becker then laments Heidegger's shift after being in time, a shift Heidegger dubs himself the turn, die Kehre, because Heidegger decides to, quote, abandon the intention of scholarship and research as dubious, unquote, at Becker's greatest disappointment, of course, since the latter had dedicated himself to philosophy in the tradition of the great ancient pre-Socratics. Heidegger's turn, however, did not prevent Becker from formulating his own reservation about the very method that enables his philosophical coming of age, so to speak. Becker, this continues, and I quote, "Many considerations came to me, both before and after. Later, and above all, came the doubt about the all-encompassing significance of historical interpretive hermeneutic thinking. Mathematics does not agree with that, nor can the question of the aesthetic be so posed. And finally, the appearance and trace effect of the so-called unconscious in the soul form an unsolvable difficulty," unquote. Indeed, Becker divides up the realm of paraontology into three categories, which roughly correspond to what he's communicating to Heidegger in this letter. So you have first the supra-historical, which encompasses mathematics or mathematical and logical truth. Then the subhistorical, which corresponds to nature. And the third, the prehistorical, which includes the primitive. And of course, as a staunch Nazi he is, Becker does not shy away from using racist talk about tribes, etc. But the latter category also includes children. So it is interesting to observe how Becker comes to make his case in relation to the development of the concept of transcendence in the history of Western philosophy. In his 1937 essay, Transcendence and Paratranscendence, Becker begins by showing how Plato's famous phrase in the Republic, "Epikein ates ousias," the good beyond being, yields an expression of transcendence semantically doubled, from which the distinct use of the term transcendence and transcendental in Latin, will first make their way into philosophical language only after Kant. This prompts Becker then to raise the question as to, quote, whether or not a double meaning slumbered in the concept of transcendence, that is, from the beginning, or was induced, as it were, end quote. The contradiction Becker is pointing to, contradiction that remains somewhat elusive in the work of Plato, is that on the one hand, beyond being represent the idea of the good as the highest of the ideas, and on the other, the phrase implies that though the good is the highest of them, it remains nonetheless, at least originally, to use Becker's language, an idea. Herein lies, Becker therefore gathers, quote, a paradox, if not a contradiction. I'll spare you the short but detailed detour Becker takes via Aristotle, who Becker shows takes heed of this inherent tension and ultimately deems philosophy the general science, presiding over all other regional or particular disciplines, because its subject matter, that venerable and first substance, to use Aristotle's or Becker's language, presides over and beyond all the whole. Thus, Aristotle shows that metaphysics as first philosophy is both, quote, thought as a universal doctrine of being, all beings, and as a theory of the divine, unquote. From this, Becker concludes, two types of transcendence are entangled, I'm quoting him here, in one another. First, the proper transcendence of being itself over beings, and second, the quasi-transcendence of the first being the divine. It is the latter, that is, the quasi-transcendence of the first divine being, that Becker's names paratranscendence. So the point here, however, is that transcendence and paratranscendence stands in co-equal relation. However, whereas transcendence connotes a surmounting or surpassing, paratranscendence is an unemergedness, wherein the surpassing of transcendence still occurs, but in such a manner that, quote, that out of which the surmounting emerges, that is, the things, does not completely sink into nothingness, as is the case with transcendence, unquote. Of course, this is a direct polemic against Heidegger, for whom the nothing is more originary than beings, including Dasein. As we know, fundamental attunements such as anxiety unveils the ways in which we are in the midst of beings. However, by virtue of its ability to deprive us of speech, anxiety in particular uncovers the presence of the nothing that surrounds us in such a manner that once anxiety has dissipated, we can be aware of the openness of beings. Since Dasein means, Heidegger says, being held out into the nothing, transcendence is thus Dasein's ability to stand out in the midst of nothing. So this is exactly the point against which Becker objects with the concept of paratranscendence. Whereas for him, transcendence, and I quote, inescapably bears a nihilistic inclination, unquote, the unemerged in paratranscendence remains, he insists, quote, thoroughly and in every respect positive. In short, as he argues, the unemergedness, quote, lacks the violence of true transcendence, unquote. So the point here really is that Becker wants to show that there is nothing contingent about the phenomenon of transcendence. Such a phenomenon is necessary, and the non-violence of its simplicity lies in the fact that it grows organically on its own thanks to its sheer capacity for organic growth, while at the same time, and this is very important, it never leaves behind, quote, the maternal soil out of which it sprouted and in which it remains rooted, unquote. At this point in the text, Becker affirms unequivocally that paratranscendence, and this is his language, is thus above all the natural, that which is according to nature, unquote. In fact, he even doubles down and says the concept of nature must be taken completely literally. Nature means birth, unquote. Much can be said about this notion of birth in relation to his scholarly commitments as a mathematician, but notions such as nature and birth provide him with the opportunity to introduce the primacy of necessity in contradistinction to the importance of possibility over actuality in Heidegger's work. Moreover, Becker points out, birth is a metaphysical countermove to Heidegger's thrownness, insofar as being born is not being created from out of nothing. Indeed, Becker poignantly claims existential thrownness, and I quote, reveals that the existing human is not powerful over its ground in neither capability nor knowledge. Right? So this, Heidegger Dasein is super weak. The point here is that unlike Heidegger, who not only holds a rather ambiguous relationship to the question of inheritance generally, and in spite of his nationalism, remained disdainfully allergic to the circuit of Nazi biologism, Becker is vehemently committed to the vitalism of a productive power, insofar as birth and ancestry are the condition for the possibility of human existence as unbroken humanity. Unbroken humanity understood as generational existence, thus reveals the fundamental experience of racial belongingness, the belonging to particular people, he says, and a particular homeland's landscape. What such fundamental experience, and really is this question of belonging to a particular people, particular race, etc., these are the fundamental experience he's talking about. So what these fundamental experience renders more visible in turn, he emphasized, are, quote, the old maternal powers of blood and earth, unquote. So these passages of the text are, of course, unequivocally Nazi. For not only is Becker's vitalist conception of blood set to determine the types or the stocks of humans, Earth, as the imperishable and untiring goddess, anchors the naturalness of the being of such fundamental experience. But it is also here that one might discern a pivotal point in this essay, which will culminate in the very concept we have been trying to trace thus far. Following a series of rhetorical questions about human Dasein, Becker straightforwardly claims that the natural manner of living, this is his language, he has been describing thus far, cannot be termed Dasein. Rather, he opts for the term Davesen, as the Da compound here includes the Middle High German verb wesen, or to be naturally. I don't have the time to really talk about this at length, but my great friend Ben Brewer, who translated this essay, has incredible footnotes. And I'm going to quote him here, just footnotes kind of like explaining some of the things that we're missing with our English ears. But one of the things that Ben says is that natural here should be heard simultaneously in terms of having to do with nature, but also in the sense of something's essence or character, the nature of a given being. So unlike the questions Dasein poses to the existential analytic, Becker points out, it is here, quote, no longer the being of the human being that stands in question, but rather its essential being, Wesen, More precisely, it's naturally being natural being, unquote. Becker's anti-historical stance isn't, of course, lost on us, but the point is that although historical men possess a natural being, he is also just not that natural being. He is not one, essentially. Only the natural men, Becker argues, the human still near to naive originality, and that includes children, is a natural being. Such being, he says, naturally is. And here's where we approach a decisive moment of the essay. So to describe the existence of the natural man, Becker thus writes, and I quote, his existence, or now let's say more precisely, his para-existence is to be essentially, unquote. Indeed, Becker is adamant at this juncture of the text that his intervention is neither mere wordplay nor hair splitting, to use his language. Rather, he brazenly asserts that, quote, the fundamental determination of ontology itself is here shaken and transformed, unquote. So with equal impudence, he rejects Heidegger's ontological difference, that is the distinction between being and beings, because in the realm of the natural being, there is no ontological inequality between the ontic and the ontological. Rather, and the punchline comes just about a page before the end of the essay, there is para-ontological equality. That is, natural being is identical with the being which naturally is. One needs to be cautious, however, because this para-ontological equality, which he then calls para-ontological indifference, somewhat transmogrifying Heidegger's ontological difference, is not some pious idea of equality. This undifferentiatedness, so to speak, between natural being and the being that naturally is, as Becker says himself, is, quote, nothing other than the unemergentness of the para-transcendental, unquote. In other words, the equality here is between the being that is natural and nature, qua birth, which all those fundamental experiences imply necessarily. And the fundamental experiences, we shall recall, are racial and national belongingness, in short, blood and soil. Becker's final point here is that natural being cannot be ontologically read because it is only para-ontologically determinable. The distinction made between proper and improper existence are not meaningful, perhaps even completely obsolete. And here, of course, what you want to hear is his another attack against another Heideggerian trope, that of authenticity. In fact, Becker bestows the adjective improper on natural being to claim Dasein co-originarity with Dasein. As he puts it, and I quote, the pure, completely improper Dasein in all its plainness is indeed co-originary with proper originary Dasein. In its paratranscendent unemergentness, Becker concludes, Dasein is fundamentally questionless. That is to say, it is not question-worthy in the way of Dasein. So I've been attempting to question exactly what motivated my own venture into the rather short history of this term, para-ontology. The term is hardly yet a century old, and its eclectic reverberations suggest a troubling kind of proximity. I questioned myself because I considered whether the mere history of the term was a good enough reason to undertake the research itself. After all, Derrida had taught us, as Jeffrey Bennington eloquently puts it, that, quote, ideas always escape any given context in a way that breaks and bursts any semantic or hermeneutic horizons, unquote. So less driven by a historicist injunction, which often demands that one restores ideas back to their context without necessarily asking how they got out in the first place, I wanted to hear Bennington's Derridian cautionary call that, quote, putting ideas back into their context may often be a good way to proceed, but putting them back without accounting for their initial escape seems a little irresponsible, unquote. For indeed, the very history of the term para-ontology is conditioned by its very unusual escape from the grips of fascist ideology. That escape itself is both the condition for the possibility of its history, the concept's history, and the very historicity of the concept itself. So it is thus unsurprising that tracing the history of this escape led me, in addition to Becker and Heidegger, also to Chandler, who many continue to credit for the concept. But, or rather, maybe allow me to exercise my own right to hyperbole and say that what I found there might have been a bit more perplexing than what I already knew about the term's fascist roots. First, the term appears nowhere in Chandler's published work. Moten, Judy, J. Cameron Carter, Calvin Warren, to name just a few, all provide a citation for Chandler's para-ontology unpublished work. When either dates or pages, or both, are provided, they have not led me anywhere concretely. For instance, both Judy and Carter cite seemingly the same manuscript, dated 2006, but with different pagination. Then Moten cites a manuscript dated 2007, which then Carter cites and infers that one reads there what Chandler has says about para-ontology, but then again, here as well, both index different pagination. And I don't know what text it is. Hence, my ongoing aspiration to account for this term's escape appear to be circumstantially truncated. The most public, explicit, and even perspicuous treatment of para-ontology I've been able to track from Chandler is the lecture I referred to earlier. Thus, I've tried to treat the lecture in an indicial fashion by following where and when Chandler locates the para-ontological method in his written work. For instance, having explicitly described his own method to be more lucid than Moten's Denis Ferrer da Silva's, Chandler names the first chapter of X, The Problem of the Negro, as a problem of thought, just title of Exorbitance, as the very deployment of his para-ontological approach. I must say that when it comes to this proclaimed lucidity, I have to agree with Chandler. More on him, unfortunately, I don't have the time to do this here, but more on him will appear in the published version of this talk. So you can read more of that stuff there. But with the little bit of time I have left, it is worth pointing to some crucial signposts. First, one cannot ignore the very long quote when accompanied with a remarkably long endnote from Derrida's interview in the book titled Positions. But unfortunately, many do and many have. We can infer from this rather telling incipit that Chandler's point, unlike Judy, rather hasty aspiration, isn't to refute ontology. For such a refutation, what Derrida calls a neutralization, will leave one with no hold on the opposing side, thereby, quote, preventing any means of intervening in the field in question effectively, unquote. What Chandler faces indeed is a hierarchical racial domination of the term Negro in the ontological organization of being, whereby whiteness operates like the invisible because unthematized governing term of the opposition. The point here, therefore, isn't to protest, as Derrida says, quote, in the simple form of neither nor that, unquote. Such ubiquitous maneuver only worked to reestablish the very dual opposition one sought to displace. Rather, a deconstructive analysis, which is also to say an interminable analysis, dislodges a sedimented hierarchy with an inverting double movement that remains lucidly aware of the very fact that its operation only takes place within the deconstructed system. The overturning of the hierarchy remains necessary nonetheless, for once the ground upon which the dominant term secures its authority are questioned, only a reversal can ensure that the hegemon isn't reinstituted. One of the crucial phases, and I'm of course using that word with a grain of salt, is perhaps the moments of reinscription. Reinscription isn't, however, a pious substitution of one form of plenitude for another. The inhabitation of old thought in a new way, to use Chandler's language, does not entail positing another affirmation, such as an unequivocal name or a locatable site of operation, even if these are offered in the form of a negativity. This is why Chandler understands Du Bois's discourse on double consciousness to be the production of a second site, as opposed to a pure and simple habitation of any given world. That second site, nonetheless, displaces traditional ontology, even if Du Bois did not have in mind, as Chandler says, quote, an original sense of being in the world, unquote, but rather, and I quote again, a sense of being that in itself could not be reduced to some simple essence of either the past or of a future, unquote. The point here is that chasing the unthought, which seems to be more of a programmatic endeavor in Black studies nowadays, rather than a contingent and unexpected discovery from restless thinking and protracted research, is neither Du Bois's aim nor Chandler's, nor part of Chandler's paleontological agenda, so to speak. The difference is that Chandler thinks that Blackness poses radical questions about ontology, whereas the other version of paleontological methods start from the puzzling conceit that Blackness puts ontology radically into question. And this is why Chandler says that the heterogeneous practice of paleontology is less concerned with, quote, what is or what has been given, unquote, or even with that which remains the yet impossible possibility, that which may yet be given, and that's his language as well. Rather, the paleontological practice, appear to be a method of revelation profoundly suspicious of any given form of necessity. With Chandler's ontology, in other words, we are nowhere near the ahistorical grounds of Becker's natural being, nor are we invested in Moten's telic reclamation of dispossessed being, nor are we even in Judy's ambitious refusal to be circumscribed by ontology. To be ontologically and phenomenologically unreadable isn't, of course, synonymous with flight or fugitivity. Chandler's paleontology is thoroughly historical and faithfully historicist, albeit in a deconstructive manner. In the context of a critique of ontology, Chandler's incessant double movement is about turning new soil on old grounds, he says, whereby grounds here still connote a kind of strategic borrowing from the very discourse one seeks to displace. This is why Derrida, for instance, says in the very text, which everybody ignores, but which seems to be a significant concern for Chandler. So in this text, Derrida says, and as I said, a text that Chandler reserves a considerable amount of attention that, in spite of the many reservations he's had about the term history, Derrida has used the concept of history very often, and I quote, in order to reinscribe its force and in order to produce another concept or a conceptual chain of history, a history that implies a new logic of repetition and the trace, for it is difficult to see how there could be history without it, end quote. And this is exactly what Chandler calls in his paleontological practice hyper-thematization and hyperbolization. There are moments, and these moments really are moments of remarking and reinscribing history, not, as Chandler emphasizes, in a historiographical sense, but in the probing of disclosing another order of history. Hyperbolization, Chandler then clarifies, opens, quote, the space to re-look at dimensions of historicity that would otherwise not appear as a problem for thought, unquote. So now, having said all of this, I'm left to say something by way of conclusion about my title. More specifically, what about this regretful inheritance? It seems to me that Chandler may be the most attuned to the intricate question of tradition and its transmissibility. Rather than sidestepping or outright refusing an inherited legacy, Chandler's paleontology summons us, it seems, to this difficult question. How does one inherit responsibly from a secret, the violence of which one can barely bear? What kind of relationship to the legacy of inheritance can we sustain as the unwanted and yet indispensable heirs of ontology, of Becker, and of inheritance itself? In other words, I'm saying the very structure of inheritance would crumble without the block. In that regard, what would it mean for us to appropriate a legacy that needs us for its sustenance and that simultaneously, fundamentally resists being claimed by us? And if indeed inheriting is another form of debt, of indebtedness, for the very possibility, another form of debt, of indebtedness, since, indebtedness is kind of like the very possibility of speech altogether in this context. And if all debts must be returned one way or another, shouldn't we be asking ourselves what we're willing to pay for such mortgage? I, of course, have no real answers to these questions at the moment. But what I do know is that some mortgages will fuck up your credit. Thank you.